Welcome to the Listening Room, a quiet place for long-form thought, calm exploration, and deep understanding. Settle in and let's begin. Perfectionism is often mistaken for a virtue. In many cultures, it is quietly praised, subtly rewarded, and rarely questioned. The person who checks their work 3 times, who refuses to submit something that feels incomplete, who stays late to correct details no one else even notices, this person is seen as disciplined, conscientious, perhaps even admirable. From childhood onward, we are taught that striving for excellence leads to success, security, and respect. The line between excellence and perfection, however, is thin and easily crossed without awareness. What begins as a healthy desire to do something well can slowly transform into an internal demand that nothing less than flawless will suffice. Yet beneath this polished surface lies a more complicated reality. Perfectionism is not simply about high standards. It is not synonymous with diligence or care. At its core, perfectionism is driven less by the pursuit of excellence and more by the avoidance of failure, criticism, or perceived inadequacy. It is a protective strategy disguised as ambition. The perfectionist is not merely trying to do well, they are trying to prevent something painful from happening: disapproval, embarrassment, loss of status, or the feeling of not being enough. This topic matters because perfectionism touches nearly every domain of human life. It shapes how we work, how we relate to others, how we rest, and even how we evaluate our own worth. It influences decisions, large and small, whether to start a project, whether to share an idea, whether to speak up in a meeting, whether to pursue a dream that carries the risk of visible failure. Many people who consider themselves not perfectionists still feel its influence in quieter ways: procrastination, chronic dissatisfaction, difficulty celebrating accomplishments, or an inability to relax without guilt. Historically, perfectionism has evolved alongside societal expectations. In eras where survival depended primarily on physical labor and community cooperation, perfection had little practical meaning. Adequate was sufficient. In modern societies, however, where performance can be measured, compared, and publicly displayed, the pressure to appear exceptional has intensified. Education systems reward top grades. Professional environments reward productivity metrics. Social media amplifies curated success stories while hiding the messy process behind them. The result is a cultural atmosphere in which imperfection feels increasingly visible and increasingly costly. Understanding perfectionism, then, is not simply about understanding a psychological trait. It is about understanding a psychological pattern that can quietly shape an entire life trajectory. It helps explain why capable people hesitate to begin, why accomplished individuals feel like imposters, why rest feels undeserved, and why satisfaction remains elusive even after meaningful achievements. It also helps explain a paradox: how the pursuit of perfect outcomes can ultimately produce less progress, less creativity, and less well-being. This episode will show that perfectionism carries a hidden cost that is rarely acknowledged. It trades growth for safety, creativity for control, and genuine fulfillment for the temporary relief of avoiding mistakes. You will gain a clearer understanding of why perfectionism feels so compelling, how it subtly influences behavior and thought, and why it often produces the very outcomes it seeks to prevent. Rather than condemning perfectionism or glorifying it, we will explore it calmly, with evidence-based reasoning and thoughtful reflection, so that you can see it more clearly in yourself and in the world around you. To begin this exploration, we must first understand what perfectionism actually is and what it is not. Perfectionism is frequently confused with high standards, but the two are fundamentally different. High standards are flexible, perfectionism is rigid. High standards are oriented toward improvement, perfectionism is oriented toward evaluation. A person with high standards can complete a task, learn from it, and move forward. A perfectionist struggles to declare anything finished because finished never feels sufficient. The internal benchmark keeps shifting just beyond reach. Psychologists often distinguish between adaptive striving and maladaptive perfectionism. Adaptive striving involves setting challenging goals while maintaining self-compassion and perspective. Maladaptive perfectionism, by contrast, is characterized by harsh self-criticism, fear of mistakes, and an excessive dependence on external validation. Importantly, the external behavior of these two patterns can look nearly identical. Both individuals may work hard, produce high-quality output, and appear successful. The difference lies in the internal experience. One feels motivated and engaged, the other feels pressured and perpetually behind. A key mechanism underlying perfectionism is conditional self-worth. Instead of believing, "I am valuable as a person," the perfectionistic mind operates on the assumption, "I am valuable if I perform well." This subtle shift transforms ordinary tasks into tests of identity. A mistake is no longer just a mistake, it becomes evidence of inadequacy. Success is no longer satisfying in itself, it becomes proof that one has temporarily avoided being exposed as insufficient. This conditional structure creates chronic tension. If worth depends on flawless performance, then every situation becomes high stakes. Even minor tasks carry disproportionate emotional weight. Sending an email, submitting an assignment, cooking a meal for guests, or making a routine decision can trigger extended rumination because the mind treats each action as a referendum on competence or character. Another important feature of perfectionism is its relationship to control. Perfect outcomes are predictable outcomes. They minimize uncertainty and reduce the likelihood of negative evaluation. For individuals who feel uneasy with unpredictability, whether due to temperament, upbringing, or past experiences, perfectionism can feel like a rational strategy. If everything is done flawlessly, nothing can go wrong. Of course, reality does not cooperate with this logic. External variables, other people's perceptions, and sheer chance ensure that outcomes remain partly uncontrollable. This gap between desired certainty and actual uncertainty fuels ongoing anxiety. Perfectionism also reshapes the way time is experienced. Tasks take longer because of repeated revisions, hesitation, and second-guessing. Opportunities may be delayed or abandoned entirely because conditions never feel ideal. Ironically, the pursuit of perfect readiness often prevents meaningful engagement with the real world, where learning occurs through iteration rather than immaculate planning. Consider for a moment how perfectionism influences creativity. Creative work inherently involves experimentation, failure, and ambiguity. Ideas must be expressed before they can be refined. Drafts must be imperfect before they can become polished. The perfectionistic mind resists this process because it demands a level of certainty that creativity cannot provide. As a result, potential artists, writers, entrepreneurs, and innovators may never fully explore their abilities, not because they lack talent, but because they cannot tolerate the vulnerability of producing something incomplete. Perfectionism also shapes relationships. When self-worth is tied to performance, it becomes difficult to be authentically seen. Admitting uncertainty, asking for help, or revealing struggles may feel dangerous because it exposes imperfection. Others may perceive the perfectionist as composed or highly capable, while internally they feel isolated and exhausted. Over time, this discrepancy can erode intimacy and increase loneliness. There is also a physiological dimension. Chronic pressure to perform activates the body's stress response. Elevated cortisol, muscle tension, disrupted sleep, and mental fatigue are common consequences. The body, in effect, treats everyday life as a continuous examination that must not be failed. Even rest can feel uneasy because the mind continues scanning for unfinished tasks or potential shortcomings. One of the most subtle aspects of perfectionism is that it often hides behind socially acceptable behaviors. Working long hours, being meticulous, avoiding risk, or striving for top performance rarely attract concern from others. In fact, these behaviors are often rewarded. This external reinforcement can make it difficult for individuals to recognize that the pattern is costly. From the outside, things may look successful. From the inside, they feel unsustainable. It is also important to note that perfectionism does not arise randomly. It is shaped by experience. Some individuals grow up in environments where approval is contingent on achievement. Others internalize cultural messages equating success with worth. Some discover early in life that excelling reduces criticism or conflict. Over time, the brain learns that perfectionistic behavior appears to produce safety, and the pattern becomes automatic. Yet, the safety is partial and temporary. Because flawless performance is unattainable, the system never fully relaxes. Each success raises the standard for the next attempt. Instead of building confidence, achievements may actually intensify pressure. The person becomes trapped in a cycle of striving without a rival. At this point, you might consider your own experiences. Do you find it difficult to feel satisfied with work that others consider more than adequate? Do you postpone starting tasks because you want to do them right? Do compliments feel fleeting, quickly replaced by awareness of what could have been better? These are not signs of laziness or lack of discipline. They are indicators of a mind attempting to protect itself through control and precision. A gentle question for you as you listen. When you imagine doing something imperfectly but honestly, what emotion arises first? Relief, discomfort, or fear? In the next chapter, we will explore the origins of perfectionism more deeply, examining how early learning, personality traits, and social structures interact to produce this pattern. Understanding where perfectionism comes from does not eliminate it, but it does loosen its authority. When we see a pattern as learned rather than inherent, we gain the possibility of relating to it differently. For now, simply notice how perfectionism operates, not as a moral failing or a badge of honor, but as a complex strategy shaped by human vulnerability and the desire to belong, to be safe, and to be valued. Chapter 2: Where Perfectionism Comes From. If perfectionism were simply a matter of personality, it would be far easier to understand and far easier to change. One might say, some people are perfectionists, others are not, and leave it at that. But human behavior rarely fits into such tidy categories. Perfectionism emerges from a convergence of influences: temperament, early experience, cultural expectations, and learned beliefs about how the world works. It is less like a fixed trait and more like a strategy that becomes deeply ingrained over time. One of the most powerful influences is early feedback about worth and acceptance. Children are exquisitely sensitive to the signals they receive from caregivers and authority figures. They do not merely hear what adults say, they infer what is required to remain loved, safe, and included. If praise consistently follows achievement, the child learns that performance is the pathway to approval. If mistakes lead to criticism, withdrawal, or disappointment, the child learns that errors threaten connection. These lessons need not be explicit. Subtle patterns repeated over years are sufficient to shape enduring expectations. Importantly, this process does not require harsh or neglectful parenting. Many perfectionists come from loving homes where caregivers genuinely wanted the child to succeed. Encouragement to do your best, pride in good grades, or admiration for talent can inadvertently communicate that excellence is the child's defining feature. The child, eager to maintain that positive image, may begin to equate being valued with being exceptional. Over time, ordinary performance feels insufficient, not because anyone demands perfection explicitly, but because the child has internalized the belief that excellence is what keeps them secure. Temperament also plays a role. Some individuals are naturally more sensitive to feedback, more conscientious, or more prone to anxiety. These traits can make them especially responsive to environmental cues. A highly sensitive child in a moderately demanding environment may develop perfectionistic tendencies, whereas a less sensitive child in the same environment may not. This interaction between disposition and experience explains why siblings raised in the same household can develop very different attitudes toward mistakes and achievement. School environments often reinforce these tendencies. Education systems are structured around evaluation, grades, rankings, standardized tests, performance metrics. While these tools serve practical purposes, they also create a continuous comparison framework. Students learn not only what they know, but where they stand relative to others. For some, this motivates healthy effort. For others, particularly those already inclined towards self-criticism, it fosters a chronic sense that being average is equivalent to failing. Social comparison intensifies during adolescence, a period when identity is especially malleable and peer approval carries enormous weight. Achievements become markers of status, competence, and future potential. At the same time, mistakes feel magnified because they occur in a social context where embarrassment can linger. The adolescent brain, highly attuned to social evaluation, may conclude that flawless performance is the safest route through an unpredictable social landscape. Modern technology amplifies this effect. Digital platforms present curated versions of others' lives, accomplishments, milestones, polished appearances, and carefully selected moments of happiness. Rarely do they show the discarded drafts, failed attempts, or mundane realities that constitute most of human experience. Repeated exposure to these highlight reels can distort perceptions of what is normal, creating the impression that everyone else is succeeding effortlessly. The perfectionistic mind interprets this as evidence that anything less than outstanding is inadequate. Cultural narratives also contribute. Many societies equate success with moral virtue. Hard work, discipline, and achievement are framed not just as desirable, but as indicators of character. Conversely, failure may be interpreted as laziness or weakness rather than as an inevitable part of learning. This moral framing raises the stakes of performance. If success signifies goodness, then imperfection threatens not just competence, but identity. Another pathway into perfectionism involves attempts to manage uncertainty. Life contains many variables beyond individual control: health, economic conditions, other people's actions, random events. For individuals who find unpredictability distressing, striving for perfection can feel like a way to impose order. If everything is planned meticulously and executed flawlessly, perhaps uncertainty can be minimized. While this strategy may provide temporary reassurance, it cannot eliminate unpredictability, leading to ongoing vigilance and tension. Traumatic or highly stressful experiences can further intensify this need for control. When the world has felt chaotic or unsafe, precision and predictability become psychologically comforting. Perfectionism in this context functions as a stabilizing mechanism. It creates a sense of structure and competence that counteracts feelings of vulnerability. However, because the underlying anxiety remains, the behavior must be repeated continuously to maintain the illusion of control. It is also worth considering how language shapes self-perception. Labels like smart, gifted, or the responsible one may seem positive, but they can become restrictive identities. A child praised primarily for intelligence, for example, may become reluctant to attempt tasks that risk revealing limits. Maintaining the identity becomes more important than exploring new challenges. Psychologists sometimes refer to this as a fixed mindset, an orientation in which abilities are seen as static traits that must be demonstrated rather than developed. Perfectionism thrives in environments like these because mistakes threaten the stability of the label. Conversely, environments that emphasize effort, curiosity, and learning from errors tend to foster resilience rather than perfectionism. When mistakes are treated as information rather than as failures, the individual can engage with challenges without fearing that their worth is at stake. This distinction highlights an important point. Perfectionism is not inevitable. It is shaped by context, and different contexts can produce different outcomes. Another subtle contributor is the human tendency to remember negative feedback more vividly than positive. From an evolutionary perspective, paying attention to threats was adaptive. A single overlooked danger could have serious consequences, whereas missed opportunities for praise were less critical. In modern settings, this bias can lead individuals to fixate on criticism while discounting approval. The result is a skewed internal narrative in which shortcomings loom large and successes fade quickly. Over time, these influences coalesce into an internal voice that monitors performance relentlessly. This voice may sound like a concerned advisor, a strict teacher, or an uncompromising judge. It anticipates potential errors, rehearses scenarios, and revisits past mistakes in an attempt to prevent future ones. Because it develops gradually, individuals may assume it represents their true self rather than a learned pattern. What makes this internal system particularly powerful is that it occasionally works. Careful preparation can lead to good outcomes. Attention to detail can prevent problems. High effort can produce recognition. Each success reinforces the belief that perfectionistic behavior is necessary. The mind concludes, if I stop being this careful, something bad will happen. This intermittent reinforcement makes the pattern resistant to change, much like habits formed through variable rewards. However, the cost accumulates quietly. Time spent perfecting one task is time not spent exploring others. Energy devoted to preventing mistakes reduces capacity for spontaneity and play. Relationships may be affected when work consistently takes precedence or when vulnerability feels unsafe. Because these costs are diffuse and gradual, they may not be immediately apparent, especially if external success continues. Consider how this pattern might manifest in everyday situations. A person may spend hours composing a message that could have been written in minutes. They may avoid pursuing a new hobby because they fear being a beginner. They may decline opportunities that involve public evaluation even when those opportunities align with their interests. To observers, these behaviors might seem puzzling or even contradictory. Internally, however, they feel logical, attempts to maintain safety and dignity in a world perceived as judgmental. It is also important to recognize that perfectionism often coexists with other psychological patterns, such as anxiety or depression. The relationship is bidirectional. Perfectionistic thinking can increase stress and self-criticism, which in turn can contribute to emotional difficulties. Conversely, feelings of inadequacy or uncertainty can intensify the drive to compensate through flawless performance. Understanding these interactions helps explain why perfectionism is not simply a preference for neatness or order, but a complex cognitive emotional system. At this stage, you might reflect on your own history. When did you first become aware of wanting to do things perfectly? Was there a moment when mistakes began to feel especially costly? Or has it always seemed natural, as though anything less would be unacceptable? These questions are not meant to assign blame, but to illuminate the pathways through which patterns develop. A quiet question for you to consider. If no one were watching, evaluating, or remembering your mistakes, how differently might you approach the things you care about? In the next chapter, we will examine one of the most paradoxical aspects of perfectionism, how the pursuit of flawless performance often leads to procrastination, avoidance, and reduced productivity, the very opposite of what perfectionists intend. Understanding this paradox reveals why perfectionism can feel both exhausting and ineffective at the same time. Chapter 3: The Paradox of Productivity When Perfectionism Slows You Down. Perfectionism presents itself as a productivity strategy. It promises superior results, fewer errors, and outcomes that will stand the test of scrutiny. On the surface, this seems reasonable. Careful planning, attention to detail, and thorough execution are indeed components of high-quality work. Yet, many individuals who struggle with perfectionism notice a troubling contradiction. Despite investing enormous effort, they often feel behind, overwhelmed, or unable to complete tasks efficiently. Projects stall. Deadlines loom. Simple actions expand into complex ordeals. What was meant to guarantee success begins to interfere with progress itself. This paradox arises because perfectionism shifts the goal from completion to flawlessness. Completion has a clear endpoint. Flawlessness does not. When the standard is good enough, a task can be finished, evaluated, and released. When the standard is perfection, there is always one more improvement to make, one more revision to consider, one more potential criticism to preempt. The finish line recedes as you approach it, turning forward movement into a treadmill rather than a journey. One of the most visible consequences of this shift is procrastination. Contrary to popular belief, procrastination is not primarily about laziness or lack of discipline. In many cases, it is driven by fear of producing something that does not meet internal standards. Starting a task creates the possibility of imperfection becoming real and visible. Avoiding the task preserves the comforting illusion that if one were to begin, the result could be excellent. Thus, delay becomes a protective maneuver. As long as the project exists only in imagination, it remains uncontaminated by mistakes. This mechanism explains why perfectionists often experience intense bursts of activity just before deadlines. When time runs out, the option of endless refinement disappears, forcing action. The result may be high quality, but it is achieved at significant emotional cost, stress, sleep deprivation, and a sense of crisis. Because the final outcome is often acceptable or even impressive, the mind interprets the process as effective, reinforcing the cycle. What is overlooked is how much easier and healthier the same outcome could have been with a less perfectionistic approach. Another productivity drain comes from over-preparation. Planning is valuable, but perfectionism transforms planning into an attempt to eliminate uncertainty entirely. Individuals may research excessively, gather more information than they can realistically use, or wait for conditions to feel ideal before beginning. This creates a false sense of readiness while postponing the actual work. In dynamic environments where conditions change rapidly, waiting for perfect clarity may mean missing opportunities altogether. Decision-making also becomes more difficult. Each choice carries the possibility of being the wrong one, leading to analysis paralysis. The perfectionistic mind seeks the optimal option, not merely a sufficient one. However, optimal choices are rarely identifiable in advance because outcomes depend on factors that unfold over time. The result is hesitation, second-guessing, and revisiting decisions that others would consider settled. Mental energy is consumed not by action, but by deliberation. During execution, perfectionism often manifests as constant monitoring. Attention is divided between performing the task and evaluating performance in real time. This self-surveillance disrupts flow, the psychological state in which attention is fully absorbed and productivity peaks. Instead of moving smoothly from one step to the next, the individual pauses frequently to assess whether the work meets expectations. Each interruption resets momentum, making sustained progress more difficult. The fear of errors can also lead to excessive caution. Risky but potentially rewarding approaches are avoided in favor of safer, more predictable methods. While this reduces the likelihood of visible mistakes, it can also limit innovation and efficiency. Sometimes the fastest route forward involves tolerating a degree of messiness or uncertainty. Perfectionism resists this, preferring slower but controlled pathways. Ironically, perfectionism can produce the very errors it seeks to prevent. Fatigue from prolonged effort, stress-induced cognitive overload, and last-minute rushes increase the probability of oversight. Moreover, because so much attention is devoted to minor details, broader strategic considerations may receive less focus. One can spend hours refining wording while neglecting the overall argument, or perfect formatting while overlooking substantive issues. The emotional consequences compound the productivity costs. When effort does not translate into visible progress, frustration builds. Tasks begin to feel heavier, more aversive, and more difficult to initiate. This emotional weight further encourages avoidance, creating a feedback loop in which reduced productivity increases anxiety, which in turn reduces productivity further. Over time, individuals may begin to doubt their abilities, interpreting the difficulty as evidence of inadequacy rather than as a byproduct of perfectionistic standards. It is also important to consider how perfectionism interacts with modern work environments, many of which demand speed and adaptability. In contexts where iterative improvement is valued, software development, creative industries, entrepreneurship, waiting for a perfect initial product is impractical. Success often depends on releasing early versions, gathering feedback, and refining over time. Perfectionism struggles with this model because it requires exposing incomplete work to external evaluation. Educational settings provide another illustration. Students who aim for perfect understanding before attempting problems may fall behind peers who learn through trial and error. The latter group accumulates experience quickly, while the former spends disproportionate time trying to prevent mistakes. Although the perfectionistic student may achieve high accuracy on completed tasks, the overall pace of learning can be slower. Relationships are affected as well. Collaborative projects require compromise, flexibility, and tolerance for others' imperfections. A perfectionist may feel compelled to redo others' work, micromanage details, or avoid collaboration altogether to maintain control. This can strain teamwork and increase personal workload, again reducing efficiency. One of the most revealing indicators of perfectionism's impact on productivity is the difficulty many individuals have with finishing tasks that do not have external deadlines. Personal projects, creative pursuits, or long-term goals may linger indefinitely because there is no forcing function to compel completion. The absence of external pressure allows the internal demand for perfection to dominate, resulting in perpetual revision or abandonment. Despite these challenges, perfectionism persists because it occasionally produces impressive results. When conditions align, sufficient time, manageable scope, supportive environment, the meticulous approach can yield exceptional work. These successes become highly salient memories, overshadowing the numerous situations where perfectionism impeded progress. The mind selectively recalls the victories, reinforcing the belief that the strategy is necessary. However, productivity is not merely about output quality, it is also about sustainability. A method that produces excellent results at the cost of chronic stress, burnout, or avoidance is ultimately inefficient over the long term. Sustainable productivity requires a balance between standards and flexibility, between diligence and acceptance of imperfection. Consider how different the experience of work might feel if completion, learning, and iteration were prioritized over flawlessness. Tasks could begin sooner, progress could be visible earlier, and feedback could guide improvement. Instead of a single high-stakes performance, work would become a series of manageable steps. This approach does not preclude excellence, it simply recognizes that excellence often emerges from refinement rather than from immaculate beginnings. A reflective question for you. Think of something you have delayed or struggled to complete. If the requirement were not perfect but merely finished, how soon could you take the next step? In the next chapter, we will explore the emotional dimension of perfectionism more deeply, how it shapes self-esteem, anxiety, and the persistent feeling of not being enough even in the presence of objective success. This internal experience is where the hidden cost becomes most apparent, because it affects not only what we do, but how we feel while doing it. Chapter 4: The Emotional Toll. Why Success Doesn't Feel Like Success. Up to this point, we have explored perfectionism as a behavioral pattern, how it shapes work habits, decision-making, and productivity. But the most significant cost is not measured in time or efficiency, it is measured in emotional experience. Perfectionism alters how success feels, how failure is interpreted, and how one relates to oneself on a moment-to-moment basis. It can create a life that looks accomplished from the outside, yet feels tense, fragile, or strangely unsatisfying from within. One of the defining emotional features of perfectionism is the inability to internalize success. Achievements are acknowledged intellectually, but not absorbed psychologically. A project may be completed, praise may be received, goals may be met, yet the sense of relief or pride is fleeting. Almost immediately, attention shifts to what could have been better or what must be done next. The mind treats success not as evidence of competence, but as a temporary reprieve from scrutiny. This pattern arises because perfectionism is fundamentally future-oriented. Instead of allowing satisfaction in the present, it scans ahead for potential deficiencies. If worth depends on continued flawless performance, then each success raises the stakes for the next endeavor. Rather than feeling secure, the individual may feel pressure to maintain or surpass the previous standard. Success becomes a new baseline rather than a destination. Another emotional consequence is chronic anxiety. When mistakes are perceived as threatening, the nervous system remains in a state of alertness. Even neutral situations can carry an undercurrent of tension because they contain the possibility of evaluation. Preparing for a presentation, attending a social gathering, or beginning a new task may trigger anticipatory worry about saying the wrong thing, appearing incompetent, or failing to meet expectations. This anxiety is not necessarily dramatic, it often manifests as a steady hum in the background of experience. Closely related is the phenomenon of self-criticism. The perfectionistic inner voice does not simply note errors, it interprets them as reflections of personal inadequacy. Language becomes harsh and absolute. I should have known better. This isn't good enough. I always mess things up. Over time, this style of internal dialogue becomes habitual, shaping self-perception even in the absence of external criticism. The individual becomes both performer and judge, rarely granting themselves the leniency they would extend to others. Perfectionism also distorts the perception of effort. Tasks that require significant work may still feel insufficient because the outcome falls short of an idealized standard. Conversely, tasks completed quickly may be dismissed as trivial, even if they are objectively valuable. This makes it difficult to experience a sense of accomplishment, since effort and outcome are filtered through an unforgiving lens. Another subtle cost is the erosion of joy. Activities once pursued for curiosity or pleasure can become performance arenas. Hobbies turn into opportunities to demonstrate competence. Leisure becomes productive leisure, something that can be justified, optimized, or evaluated. Spontaneity diminishes because unscripted experiences carry the risk of imperfection. Over time, life may feel more like a series of obligations than a landscape of possibilities. Shame is a particularly powerful emotion in perfectionism. Unlike guilt, which relates to specific actions, shame targets the self as a whole. A mistake does not simply indicate that something went wrong, it suggests that one is fundamentally flawed. Because shame is deeply uncomfortable, individuals may go to great lengths to avoid situations where it could arise. This avoidance can limit personal growth and reduce exposure to new experiences, reinforcing a narrower and more controlled lifestyle. Interpersonal dynamics are affected as well. Perfectionists often assume that others are evaluating them as harshly as they evaluate themselves, even when evidence suggests otherwise. Compliments may be discounted as politeness or misunderstanding. Neutral feedback may be interpreted as criticism. This perceptual bias can create distance in relationships as the individual remains guarded against potential judgment. There is also the phenomenon sometimes described as imposter feelings, the sense that one's achievements are undeserved and that eventual exposure as inadequate is inevitable. From a perfectionistic perspective, this makes sense. If internal standards are unattainable, then external success cannot resolve the discrepancy. Instead of confirming competence, success highlights the gap between actual performance and the imagined ideal, reinforcing the belief that one has merely gotten away with it so far. Physiologically, the emotional toll manifests in the body. Chronic stress responses can lead to fatigue, sleep disturbances, headaches, muscle tension, and difficulty relaxing. Rest itself may provoke unease because it feels unearned or risky. The body struggles to shift into recovery mode when the mind continues to rehearse tasks and anticipate problems. Another consequence is emotional volatility tied to performance outcomes. A minor setback can trigger disproportionate disappointment, while a success may produce only muted satisfaction. This imbalance creates a landscape in which negative experiences carry more weight than positive ones. Over time, mood becomes contingent on performance, leading to instability and vulnerability to burnout. It is important to recognize that perfectionism can coexist with outward composure. Many individuals appear calm, organized, and capable while internally experiencing intense pressure. Because they often continue to meet expectations, their distress may go unnoticed by others. This invisibility can deepen the sense of isolation, as they may feel that revealing their struggles would undermine the competent image they have worked so hard to maintain. Yet there is a poignant irony here. The qualities that perfectionists believe will secure approval, impeccable performance, reliability, self-sufficiency, can sometimes prevent the deeper connections they seek. Authentic relationships are built not on flawless presentation, but on shared humanity, including imperfections. When vulnerability feels unsafe, intimacy becomes difficult, and loneliness can persist even in the presence of admiration. Despite these costs, perfectionism endures because it offers moments of reassurance. Completing a task perfectly, receiving praise, or avoiding criticism can produce a temporary sense of safety. The relief feels real and meaningful. However, because the underlying conditions remain unchanged, the relief fades quickly, prompting renewed striving. This cycle resembles a treadmill, continuous effort without lasting arrival. Consider how this pattern might influence your own emotional landscape. Do you find it difficult to relax after finishing something important? Does praise feel fleeting or slightly uncomfortable? Do you move quickly from one goal to the next without pausing to acknowledge what you have accomplished? These experiences are not signs of ingratitude or lack of awareness. They are characteristic effects of a system oriented toward preventing failure rather than cultivating fulfillment. A quiet question to reflect on. If you could trust that your worth would remain intact regardless of performance, how differently might success feel? In the next chapter, we will turn to one of the most profound hidden costs of perfectionism, its impact on growth, creativity, and the willingness to engage with uncertainty. This is where the pattern not only affects how life feels, but also shapes what becomes possible. Chapter 5: The Cost to Growth: How Perfectionism Shrinks Possibility. Perhaps the most consequential effect of perfectionism is not what it does to productivity or emotional well-being, but what it quietly removes from a life over time. It narrows the range of experiences a person is willing to engage with. It filters opportunities through a simple but powerful question: can I do this well enough to avoid failure or embarrassment? When the answer is uncertain, hesitation arises. When hesitation becomes habitual, entire pathways remain unexplored. Growth, by its nature, requires exposure to uncertainty. Learning something new involves being temporarily incompetent. Creativity requires producing ideas that may not work. Innovation involves trial, error, and adjustment. Perfectionism resists all of these conditions because they entail visible imperfection. As a result, the perfectionistic individual may remain within domains where competence is already established, gradually becoming more skilled, but not necessarily more expansive. This tendency towards safe competence can be deceptively comfortable. Success reinforces the belief that staying within familiar territory is wise. However, the cost becomes apparent when opportunities arise that demand beginner status, changing careers, pursuing a new passion, learning a complex skill, or expressing oneself in unfamiliar ways. The gap between current expertise and required ability can feel intolerably large, not because it truly is, but because the perfectionistic mind anticipates the discomfort of early mistakes. Creativity is particularly vulnerable to this dynamic. Creative processes are inherently iterative. First attempts are rarely polished, they are exploratory. Writers draft, artists sketch, musicians rehearse, scientists test hypotheses. Perfectionism interrupts this process by demanding high-quality output from the outset. Faced with the inevitability of imperfection, the individual may delay starting or abandon the endeavor altogether. Potential remains theoretical rather than realized. There is also an important cognitive dimension. Perfectionism encourages binary thinking: success or failure, right or wrong, acceptable or unacceptable. Nuance is lost. Partial progress may be discounted because it does not meet the ideal standard. This all-or-nothing framework makes incremental improvement difficult to appreciate, even though most meaningful development occurs gradually. When only perfect outcomes are recognized as valuable, the many steps required to reach them feel pointless. Risk tolerance diminishes as well. Activities that involve unpredictable outcomes, public speaking, entrepreneurship, creative publication, leadership roles, may be avoided despite genuine interest. The possibility of criticism or visible error outweighs the potential benefits. Over time, this avoidance can shape identity. Individuals may come to see themselves as not the type of person who pursues certain paths, when in reality they have simply been protecting themselves from perceived risk. Another subtle effect is the reduction of play. Play is a mode of engagement characterized by curiosity, experimentation, and low stakes. It is essential not only for children but for adults, supporting creativity, problem-solving, and emotional resilience. Perfectionism transforms play into performance. Activities become evaluated rather than explored. When outcomes matter more than experience, spontaneity fades, and with it the sense of lightness that makes exploration enjoyable. Learning environments provide a clear illustration of this contrast. Students who are willing to make mistakes openly often ask more questions, attempt more problems, and engage more deeply with material. Their progress may appear uneven, but over time they accumulate a broad base of understanding. Students who avoid errors may perform well on familiar tasks, yet struggle when confronted with novel challenges because their experience with uncertainty is limited. This pattern extends into professional life. Careers increasingly require adaptability, continuous learning, and comfort with ambiguity. Perfectionism, by emphasizing control and predictability, can hinder these capacities. Individuals may excel in structured roles, but feel overwhelmed when expectations are unclear or rapidly changing. Rather than experimenting and adjusting, they may wait for definitive guidance, missing opportunities to shape their own trajectories. Relationships, too, are affected by the reluctance to engage in imperfect interactions. Expressing feelings, initiating difficult conversations, or admitting uncertainty carries the risk of misunderstanding or rejection. A perfectionistic approach may lead to silence or over-preparation, which both can prevent genuine connection. Growth within relationships, learning how to navigate conflict, vulnerability, and difference, requires tolerance for discomfort that perfectionism finds difficult to permit. It is important to recognize that perfectionism does not eliminate the desire for growth. It constrains the means by which growth can occur. The individual may feel frustrated by stagnation while simultaneously resisting the behaviors that would produce change. This internal conflict can generate a sense of being trapped, wanting more but unable to move toward it without violating deeply ingrained standards. Over long periods, the cumulative effect can be profound. Life becomes optimized for minimizing mistakes rather than maximizing meaning. Paths chosen are those with predictable outcomes rather than those aligned with curiosity or purpose. Regret may emerge not from failures, but from the absence of attempts, the projects not begun, the skills not pursued, the risks not taken. There is also a societal dimension to this loss. Innovation depends on individuals willing to test ideas that may not succeed. Cultural progress relies on experimentation in art, science, and social organization. When perfectionism discourages participation in these processes, collective potential is diminished. What is lost is not only personal fulfillment, but contributions that might have enriched others. Yet there is a paradoxical hope embedded in this realization. If perfectionism restricts possibility primarily through avoidance, then expanding possibility does not require becoming flawless, it requires tolerating imperfection. Growth resumes not when fear disappears, but when action becomes possible despite fear. This shift does not demand radical transformation. It begins with small experiments, engaging in activities where outcomes are uncertain but stakes are manageable. Consider how different life might feel if mistakes were interpreted not as verdicts, but as data. Instead of asking, "What does this say about me?" one might ask, "What can this teach me?" This reframing preserves motivation while reducing the emotional burden attached to outcomes. It aligns effort with learning rather than with self-validation. A gentle question for reflection: is there something you have wanted to try but postponed because you felt you needed to be better prepared, more confident, or less likely to fail? As we move toward the conclusion, we will bring these threads together: productivity, emotional experience, and growth, to understand the full landscape of perfectionism's hidden cost. More importantly, we will consider how recognizing this pattern can change the way we interpret our own experiences, making room for a life that is not defined by flawless performance, but by meaningful engagement. Conclusion: from flawless living to fully lived. Throughout this exploration, we have not treated perfectionism as a simple habit to be broken or a personality quirk to be dismissed. Instead, we have examined it as a coherent system, one that develops gradually, serves understandable purposes, and carries consequences that extend far beyond the tasks it appears to govern. Seen from this broader perspective, Perfectionism is less about neatness, discipline, or ambition, and more about how a person relates to uncertainty, evaluation, and their own sense of worth. We began by clarifying what perfectionism truly is, not the pursuit of excellence, but the avoidance of inadequacy. High standards can coexist with flexibility and self-respect. Perfectionism cannot. It transforms ordinary activities into tests of identity, where mistakes feel like evidence of personal deficiency rather than natural components of learning. This distinction matters because it explains why perfectionism is often accompanied by tension rather than satisfaction, even when external results are impressive. We then explored how perfectionism emerges. It does not appear spontaneously, but grows from interactions between temperament, early feedback, cultural expectations, and experiences of uncertainty. Approval tied to achievement, environments emphasizing evaluation, and exposure to curated standards of success all contribute to the belief that worth must be earned through performance. Over time, this belief becomes internalized, operating automatically even in the absence of external pressure. What once may have been adaptive, helping a child gain praise or avoid criticism, can become restrictive in adulthood, when flexibility and experimentation are essential. Next, we examined the productivity paradox. Although perfectionism promises efficiency and superior outcomes, it often produces the opposite. Fear of imperfection leads to procrastination, over-preparation, indecision, and difficulty finishing tasks. Energy is consumed by monitoring and revising rather than by forward movement. The resulting stress further impairs performance, creating a cycle in which effort increases while progress stagnates. Productivity becomes episodic and crisis-driven rather than steady and sustainable. The emotional dimension revealed an even deeper cost. Success fails to provide lasting relief because internal standards remain unattainable. Anxiety persists, self-criticism intensifies, and satisfaction becomes elusive. Activities once associated with curiosity or enjoyment are reframed as performance arenas, eroding joy and spontaneity. From the outside, life may appear stable or admirable. Internally, it can feel precarious and exhausting. Perhaps most significantly, we considered how perfectionism constrains growth. By discouraging risk, experimentation, and beginner experiences, it narrows the range of possible futures. Creativity diminishes, opportunities are postponed, and play, the engine of discovery, fades. Over time, the accumulation of avoided experiences can shape identity itself, leading individuals to inhabit lives defined more by safety than by aspiration. The hidden cost is not only stress, but lost potential, paths not taken, abilities not developed, connections not formed. Understanding these patterns does not require us to reject excellence or abandon effort. The alternative to perfectionism is not mediocrity, but engagement grounded in reality rather than in fear. Excellence in its healthiest form arises from sustained curiosity, resilience, and willingness to revise. It accepts that mastery is built through imperfect attempts. In this sense, imperfection is not the opposite of excellence, it is the pathway to it. One of the most liberating insights is that self-worth need not fluctuate with performance. When worth is treated as conditional, life becomes a continuous audition. When worth is understood as inherent, performance becomes expression rather than proof. Tasks are no longer verdicts on identity, but opportunities to contribute, learn, or explore. This shift does not eliminate disappointment or ambition, but it removes the existential stakes that make every outcome feel decisive. It is also helpful to recognize that perfectionism often persists because it contains elements of truth. Care matters, effort matters, responsibility matters. The goal is not to discard these values, but to disentangle them from fear. A person can be conscientious without being self-punitive, ambitious without being anxious, and disciplined without being rigid. The qualities that drive achievement need not be accompanied by relentless pressure. From a broader perspective, imperfection is not an anomaly, but a defining feature of human existence. Biological systems are variable, learning processes are non-linear, relationships involve misunderstandings and repair. Creativity advances through iterations, not pristine beginnings. When perfectionism demands certainty and flawlessness, it sets standards that no living system can meet. The resulting tension is not a personal failure, but a mismatch between expectations and reality. There is a quiet dignity in allowing oneself to be a participant in life, rather than a curator of an idealized version of it. Participation involves risk, saying things imperfectly, attempting things without guarantees, showing up without complete preparation. Yet it is precisely this engagement that produces meaning. Experiences become vivid not because they are flawless, but because they are real. If this understanding alters anything, it may be the interpretation of your own struggles. Difficulties starting, finishing, or enjoying tasks may not indicate lack of ability or discipline. It may reflect an internal system attempting to protect you from imagined consequences of imperfection. Seeing this system clearly introduces the possibility of responding differently, not by force or self-criticism, but gradually expanding tolerance for uncertainty. Consider the cumulative effect of small shifts, submitting work when it is good enough rather than perfect, beginning projects before feeling fully ready, allowing rest without earning it through exhaustion, sharing thoughts without rehearsing them extensively. Each of these actions challenges the assumption that flawless performance is required for safety or acceptance. Over time, evidence accumulates that life continues, relationships endure, and opportunities arise even when outcomes are imperfect. A reflective question to carry with you. If the purpose of your efforts were not to avoid failure, but to experience life more fully, what might you approach tomorrow? Perfectionism often promises a life free of regret, criticism, and uncertainty. In practice, it delivers a life constrained by those very fears. The alternative is not reckless abandon, but grounded participation, a willingness to act without guarantees, to learn without self-condemnation, and to value progress over purity. Such a life may contain more visible imperfections, but it also contains more movement, more connection, and more genuine satisfaction. As we conclude, you might imagine perfection not as a destination, but as a mirage, something that appears compelling from a distance, yet recedes on approach. What remains when the mirage fades is the terrain of real life, uneven, unpredictable, and rich with possibilities that cannot be planned in advance. To walk this terrain requires courage, but it also offers a form of peace unavailable to those who remain at the edge, waiting for conditions to become ideal. You do not need to eliminate perfectionism entirely to benefit from this understanding. Simply recognizing its patterns can soften their grip. Awareness creates space between impulse and action, between judgment and response. In that space lies freedom. The freedom to choose engagement over avoidance, curiosity over control, and humanity over flawlessness. Thank you for spending this time in careful thought and reflection. This has been The Listening Room, a space for clarity, patience, and understanding. Please like and subscribe to this channel. Thank you for listening.